We're live.
Hey, what's up, everyone? So welcome to our latest live stream. This time, our guest is our good friend Amanda. Hey, what's up, Amanda?
Hi, everyone. Good to be here.
Yeah, and if people listen to the podcast, you were recently on with Jess and Gina. That was a really good episode. I really enjoyed that. The 2 hours just completely flew by, and we brought you on because you are something you're very, very well versed in, like Middle Eastern affairs. You said you studied that like at what, like the
So when I studied Middle East studies and studied Arabic when I was in college, and then I also lived in the Middle East, like off and on, between 2010 and 2012. So I lived in Lebanon, Egypt, Morocco, and Jordan.
Was that as part of like academic work, or were you just
Yes.
okay?
And then I've also spent time in Palestine. So I know that I talk a lot about China, but actually Middle East studies is really like more my like what I studied in school.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. But yeah, before we delve more into that, everyone, please subscribe if you haven't. Go like this video. If you like what you've seen in the, I guess, minute so far, go recommend to all your friends. Or after this video will be up on the channel, so go share it with others. And go subscribe to our podcast as well if you haven't. All right, so we all know what's been in the news. Has it been a week? I don't know how long it has been. Time is weird right now.
Yeah.
I think it's about a week.
It's definitely been at least a week.
Yeah.
But I just, it's hard.
You mean
What's
since like the
time?
beginning of the
I would say since the
war?
Sheikh Jarrah
Uh-huh.
evictions.
Yeah.
But the conflict itself, it's been going on for like 73 years.
Yeah.
Speaking
Yeah.
of the history, like right before this, because I really don't know too much about this, so I went on YouTube and just typed up like Israel-Palestine history, and like the second most popular, like the first one was Vox, so I was like, I don't want to watch this, probably bullshit. So then to the second one, it was something called like Crash Course. I'm like, oh, this looks legit. And then guess who is the host of that? It's John Green, the YA guy. And I was like, oh no, I don't want to
What?
learn history from the Fault in Our
Yeah.
Stars guy. So I went down. I was like, CNN, no, all that stuff. And then I found one, and so I did a little crash course on the history. But maybe Amanda, you can just do that for us, because I think a lot of people, they have a rough idea what's going on, but like the details
Okay.
are a little fuzzy.
Okay, so can I recommend a really good book for like a good introduction to Palestine, Israel?
Oh yeah, please.
It's called hold on, let me check. It's called Israel, Palestine, and U.S. Empire by Richard Becker. No, sorry, Palestine, Israel, and the U.S. Empire by Richard Becker. And if you go to Amazon, you can download it for free and read it on Kindle until tomorrow. So it was free. It's free May 15th to May 19th. And you can read it on your Kindle. You actually don't need a Kindle device to read it. You can do what I did and just read it on the Amazon Kindle cloud thing. But anyway, yeah. So basic introduction to the conflict. Israel was created modern Zionism, which is the belief in Israel as a home, a state for Jewish people, that really started taking off in the late 19th century. And there emerged this Zionist movement that would talk about, where can we establish a Jewish state, and some options that they considered were Uganda, Argentina, Palestine. So
Is this like a European thing? That's
this is a European thing. And
Wait, just hold up for a sec.
Okay.
I'm assuming Uganda was it a colony at the time when they were considering it?
uh,
Because I'm thinking like Argentina, wasn't that like a sovereign nation? Like how could they just like be like, oh yeah, well we're gonna create a Jewish state, or was it yeah? Okay, well whatever.
yeah. So, I mean, Zionism was like largely a middle class movement with support from like Rothschild oil and banking interests. And there was also It's erased from history now, but there was also a sizable anti-Zionist Jewish left who fought for equality rather than colonialism and separation, right? And prior to World War II, Zionism was considered a reactionary nationalist ideology among progressive circles, Jewish and non-Jewish. Small numbers of Zionist settlers began arriving into Palestine in 1882, and they survived thanks to the help of the indigenous Palestinian population there. So before 1948, Palestinian Arabs comprised about 92% of the population, and they owned 89% of the land. So after World War II, there were a lot of refugees, and the U.S. and Europe didn't really want to take them. So basically, the UN decided to partition Palestine, and it was backed by like the U.S. and Europe, just because it would secure their interests in the region. And so the State of Israel was created in 1948, and of course the Palestinians didn't accept it, because why would you accept this partition plan by Western powers to give your land away? So
about 1 second. So how, who is creating Israel? Why were they able to do it? To whom did those lands belong at the time?
So pre-1948, it was called Mandatory Palestine, and it was under British control.
Okay.
It was basically a British colony. So they partitioned it, and the Palestinians didn't accept it. And then, there are a lot of European settlers, Jewish settlers, who came to Israel. And then, there was a war that was fought in 1948. There were a series of massacres, and 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes. This is really the root of the conflict, what they call a conflict right now. It created, hundreds of thousands of these Palestinian refugees that are scattered throughout the world, in Israel, throughout Palestine, but also in the U.S. and Europe. And one of the primary things that they want is the right of return, because they've been refugees for over 70 years, and a lot of them still have keys to their houses, and that symbolizes the right of return. And then
what's the legal status of Palestinians now, Gazans? Are they not citizens of Israel, but they're not?
So Palestinians who live in Israel are basically second-class citizens.
But does that include, or Gaza's not, when people say in Israel, does that exclude Gaza?
Yeah, that excludes Gaza.
Right. Okay.
So
what are Gazans then in terms of their state affiliation?
They don't really have.
They're stateless.
Yeah, they don't really have any sort of citizenship status. They're not. They don't.
This
have
is a pretty unique place in the world when it comes to this, right? You literally have people that don't have any sort of sovereign right, but they're also not part of the state that surrounds them. So it's kind of weird. It's a very weird place in that sense.
Yeah. So it's an apartheid system, and a lot of people have called it an apartheid system. Palestinians who live in Israel, they're subjected to a different set of laws, and if an Israeli Jewish person and a Palestine living in Israel commit the same crime, then the Israeli will go through civil court, and the Palestinian will go through a military court.
So that's not just sort of rhetorical saying they're second-class citizens. Literally, the laws are different.
Yeah. And in the West Bank, I don't know if you're familiar with the situation in the West Bank, but you have this situation where Israelis have been moving into settlements on the West Bank, and Israel has been seizing more and more land over the past few decades for these settlements. And they have, the Jewish settlers, they have their own roads, their own hospitals, their own schools. And like Palestinians cannot drive on those roads at all. It is literally an apartheid system.
I looked at a map of West Bank today, and I turned on. What's interesting is if you turn on terrain on Google Maps, West Bank is just basically the mountains. Like it's all the mountainous areas. That's West Bank. Immediately, once you get to the plains and stuff closer to the coast, it's Israel. And there were like these maps showing over time, like where in the West Bank the Palestinians were being sort of grouped off into what they call like islands, because they're not even in the West Bank. I see they're not really connected, and it's basically like mountaintops. Like it's really there's a terrain aspect to West Bank. Like the weird shape of it is basically like the foothills of the mountains or something. It's really weird. You should see it sometime.
Yeah. So if you look at this 2005 map and like look at the West Bank, this is what it looks like with all of the settlements and all of the land that Israel has seized. It just looks like Swiss cheese, it's non-contiguous patches of land.
Is there significance to those dates, or are they just kind of like randomly chosen?
1947, this is, okay, so 2005, this is basically what it looks like now. 1967 was after the 67 war, and Israel, they seized more territory in that war. And that's 1967 is when Palestine became militarily occupied. 47, this was the partition plan that the UN had created. And then 1946 was before partition. So this is what it looks like before the state of Israel was created. So as you can see, Palestinians they comprise the majority of the population, held most of the land, and then Jewish people held a very small portion of the land, and they coexisted fairly peacefully, and got along pretty well. It was only after this mass migration of European settlers, and then this division by foreign powers that created this conflict.
Okay, so I think one of the key questions that makes it of interest for us is why is the U.S. interested in all this? Why is the U.S. so involved? It's probably not it's not a country that particularly likes Jewish people. Never had a Jewish president or something. Why do we care so much about Israel?
It's just a Western foothold in the region, securing our interests. Securing oil interests, securing resource interests, and Israel is also. It provides opposition to
Looks like we're having a bit of all right, you're back.
Okay. It's a foothold in the region basically, and Israel also provides a counterweight or an opposition to different Arab nationalists or Arab leftist movements that threaten U.S. interests.
Have you seen that Joe Biden video that surfaced recently from way back when he was talking about Israel and it was just open, Israel represents our interests. our commitment to Israel is ironclad because of strategic interests in the area. And then it's worth like comparing that to another
He also
video.
riffed on that Voltaire quote about God, where he's like, if like Israel doesn't exist, it'll be necessary to invent it. So
Yeah, that's right. And then you can contrast that. I mean, just to, because I think it's important for people to, in my opinion, like especially now, like we should talk about how China plays into this to some extent, but how there's a lot of, I think, bullshit cover that the U.S. pursues like a humanitarian, democratizing like mission in the world. Like our mission is to spread democracy and freedom and whatever. But if you look at like the stuff that politicians actually say, it's all about interests.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You know, like, it has nothing to do with, you know,
it's all
humanitarianism.
material. So what's the famous quote that's like, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests?
Yeah. Or there's I've heard very similar things like that before. America doesn't have friends; it has interests, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other Joe Biden quote that you can contrast this with was he was being accused. I think he was supporting intervention in Serbia, and people were accusing him, saying, "Well, you know, there's similar atrocities going on in Haiti. You don't give a shit about that." And he said, "Look, let's be honest. I mean, Haiti could rise 30 feet into the air or sink into the bottom of the ocean. Americans wouldn't even notice. Haiti just doesn't matter to us." So he's like, it's not about them being black. It's about them not mattering. That was his that was his answer to, you know, is this racist? He's like, no, they just don't fucking matter to us. Why would we care?
Yeah. So yeah, to bring it back to what's going on today, you know, so like what I want to say is that you know, people always say this is you know, it's a very complicated situation. It's a complex conflict, and it's really not. They only say that it's Zionist propaganda to say that. They only say that to mystify what's going on, which is basically an anti-colonial struggle on the Palestinians' part. To not live under this like brutal military occupation. I mean, we talked a little bit about the West Bank, but we didn't talk about the conditions in Gaza at all. It's a little bit of a different situation in Gaza. So in Gaza, they elected Hamas in the 2006 elections. And as a form of collective, Hamas is this Islamic resistance political party that formed in 1987. And it was an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. And, you know, Israel sort of tolerated and even like funded them for a little while because they wanted to drive a wedge between like the other resistance movements, but I don't think they anticipated its rise and its like continued resistance against Israel, and it's a form of blowback that I think they probably like didn't intend. But it's become like a formidable like resistance like movement against Israel, and so as a form of collective punishment, when they won the election, they placed Gaza under this really brutal siege, which lasts until today. So even though there are no more settlements in Gaza, all the Israeli settlers like left, and the military left maybe like a year or two before the election. Even though there's not like an Israeli presence there, they have Gaza under this really brutal siege, where Israel controls like 6 of the 7 entrances and exits to Gaza. So they control like everything that goes in and out. They control the water. They control the air. So they also control like
The electricity, right? The power.
The electricity,
Right?
the power. Gazans only get at most 4 hours of electricity a day. 90% of the water is undrinkable. And they also control, they control the food that goes in and out. So literally they calculate the caloric intake based on population, and they only allow enough food in to where, they're practically starving. So it is a really, really brutal situation. And about every 6 or 7 years, they find a reason to launch this brutal assault on the Strip. It's a very small patch of land, right? But it's home to about 2 million people. And it's often described as an open air prison. But every 6 or 7 years, they find an excuse to launch this really brutal attack, which is what's happening now. And it's very common for them to target civilian areas, hospitals, schools, and how they justify it is that they say Hamas was headquartered there or something like that. The last attack was in 2014. Yeah. And yeah, it's always a slaughter, because Hamas has basically homemade rockets, whereas Israel has these really sophisticated weapons that are funded by the US or given to them by the US. And basically, what Gaza is to them is a testing ground for new weapons that they get and then sell to the rest of the world. And
they're taking down entire apartment complexes with
entire apartment complexes. Yeah.
Yeah, that was crazy. I've never seen anything like that before.
Yeah,
I mean,
and I want to make the
9/11,
point here that Israel will say that Hamas targets civilian populations, but Hamas, they don't have the precision guidance technology that Israel does. So, Hamas will try their best to not target civilians, but Israel has the precision guidance technology, but they still use it to target, hospitals and schools and playgrounds.
Yeah.
Also, doesn't the Iron Dome knock out most of those Hamas rockets?
Yeah,
anyway?
I've heard
90%.
90% of the rockets get stopped by Iron Dome.
Yeah, the Iron Dome, yeah.
Though, which is a U.S. System that we
Yeah.
Isn't it better than anything we have? I thought our missile defense was a joke or something, but
Well, we have a larger country to protect, but
Well, it wasn't.
Even if
We're
it's
not
limited.
protecting against homemade
Yeah.
rockets that
Yeah,
have
we're
no guidance system. So I think ours are different. But yeah, on that point, Amanda, I've seen this Greta Thunberg tweeted this, where a lot of people have been caught in these sort of both sides kind of issues, and she did it. She was like, I just want to be crystal clear that I don't condone violence by anybody, Palestinian or Israeli, And, I think my feeling on that was I just don't think that those kind of tweets are actually consistent. Because the idea that you're just totally 100% intolerant to violence is kind of bullshit. What, you don't believe in self-defense?
Right.
If how would you feel about someone who was threatening to kill you or rape you or something? Would you not condone violence to defend yourself? Yeah. I'm not leaving aside the specifics of what's going on right now. Just those blanket, I don't condone violence of any sort by anyone. Clearly, that's not a consistent position.
Yeah.
That can't be true.
This is really common. She said it, but literally every other politician released the same statement. They did this sort of both sidesing of the situation where they were I believe, that I condemn violence on both sides. I condemn Hamas, but Palestinians have the right to should like have human rights, but Israel has the right to exist. But it's just like this sort of, it doesn't take into account that, I mean, it sort of assumes that both parties come to the table as like equals, when that's not the case at all. You have like the state that has the backing of the U.S. and gets
nukes.
like $4 billion a year from the U.S. for their military and nuclear weapons. And then you have like, you know, this population under siege that has been living under occupation for like decades, who doesn't even have a military. So yeah, like I don't.
It's crazy to me. What's his name? Trevor Noah got kind of called out for this shit too. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, we should talk. You've been really active in sort of like, you know, on the ground demonstrations in New York and other, like, want to hear about that, because I feel like this time it seems different than 2014. I feel like the response has been a lot more negative towards Israel than 7 years ago. Remarkably so.
I've been following this situation. You know, I've been involved in like this sort of like pro-Palestinian activism since I was in undergrad, so over 10 years. And at that time, I had started a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at my university. And at that time, it was just like it was so hard. And just fighting back against like that Zionist narrative was just an uphill battle. But
I can only imagine.
Yeah, like just following it for the like past like 10 plus years or so, there has been like a perceptible shift in the way that this is talked about. So, you know, in 2008, there was like one like Israeli incursion into Gaza. I think it was Operation Cast Lead, if I'm not mistaken. Then another one in 2014 and another one now. And I feel like people's perceptions of this are changing. Like it's very common now to call what Israel is doing apartheid. When I was setting up that Students in Justice in Palestine chapter, no one wanted to call it apartheid. People looked at you like you were crazy if you called it apartheid.
Right.
And now AOC called it apartheid in a tweet the other day. And it's really common to call what Israel is doing ethnic cleansing. So yeah, I feel like the needle has been moved and people are talking about it in this way, but politicians and legacy media are still like, they still have yet to catch up.
Well, the other big part of this is the, you know, I'm assuming you're not Jewish.
I'm not Jewish.
And I think that a lot of what I've seen, and I'm probably one of the reasons why I've never really cared about or thought about this, is because up until recently, I was of the opinion like this isn't my issue because I'm not, you know, I'm not Jewish. I don't have relatives in Israel or anything like that. But I've noticed this time that there is a lot of boxing out of the topic to say, stay out of it. If you talk about Zionism, this is a code word for anti-Semitism, or it's
Hasn't that always
you know what I
been
mean?
around,
Like,
so that's one thing that the Zionists have done, is that they have very like insidiously sort of started equating Zionism with Judaism.
right.
And so they make it so that if you say like, so in 10 plus years that I've been involved in this, there are certain unspoken rules that you have to abide by. And you like have to know that you have to like kind of color within the lines, because the Zionists will use any sort of language slip to accuse you of anti-Semitism. So yeah, you learn these sort of rules like, oh, you always say Israeli, you always say Zionist. But yeah, like they have really successfully like made it so that like people equate Zionism with Judaism, and if you like criticize Zionism, they were very quick to like lob these accusations of anti-Semitism at you.
Right,
Yeah.
and they've been very successful at trying like Israel equals Judaism as well.
Exactly.
So you can't even talk about,
What-
Israel.
What do you think has changed? Because all the facts you said, laying out this, all this was common knowledge. We've had video. Remember when that, I forgot her name, but remember when that woman was run over by that bulldozer?
Rachel Corrie.
Yeah, Rachel Corrie. What was that, like 15 years ago?
I want to say it was longer than that. I think
Yeah,
it was
but
in
it was-
the early 2000s, but I'm not totally sure.
Yeah, I remember being on, magazine covers. I think YouTube may have been around at that time, so people had access to the video, and it was just like, oh, this sucks. But then, people just went on. So what has changed? Like as I said, did people suddenly grow a conscience, or, has something flipped?
I'm not really sure. I don't know. Like it might have something to do with social media, the way that like these sorts of things in videos and violations are more easily shared. It could be the way the increasing brutality that Israel subjects Palestinians to. Like the Israeli government and like the people in Israel, like they're becoming increasingly more and more nationalistic and more right wing.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of social media. I don't think it's a insignificant factor that who's like the face. I mean, like the popular face right now of the Palestinian movement. It's Bella Hadid. Who's the face of Israel? It's Alan Dershowitz. That's not a really fair matchup. So
okay, Gal Gadot.
Yeah.
Gal Gadot is
okay.
could be,
No,
so.
okay. All
I
right,
should
sure.
Oh, but
also add,
she
I
did
think,
that
like-
whole Imagine thing.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
so her like, yeah, she
She's
already pissed
canceled for
people
that.
off. She already pissed people
Yeah.
off.
And she
but-
pissed people off for the current stuff too, because she was talking about how she was in the IDF.
Yeah,
and stuff.
but I think it's a very interesting question to ask of what has changed. I think a part of it is, I think COVID has made people, may have made people just more, just eager to just, attack things that were previously sacrosanct. Also, may have made them just live more of their lives online. So the things they would have
but
kept
COVID
inside.
is like pretty recent. I don't think you can account like this change just to the past year. I do think like it owes a lot of it to like Palestinian organizers who have been, really advocating for this issue and then advocating for BDS. BDS is growing. Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is sort of this campaign to boycott Israeli goods and sanction Israel for their human rights violations until they comply. And it's based on a similar campaign that brought down apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, that's a good point. That to bring up the fact that it might seem very sudden, but there's been a lot of work done. Sort of like people who are like, "Oh, you're an overnight success," but it's you've been working at it for a long time. It could be something like that. But
Yeah, but I don't think we can, because we saw this with like BLM, because it reached a new height. Because we saw it, but when did like the Michael Brown and the Trayvon Martin stuff? What was that, like 2014 maybe?
I want to say it was 2014.
Yeah,
2014
something like
or
that.
2016. We saw that, and that was some pretty bad stuff. But it reached, for various reasons, it reached this like new height in 2020. So definitely, there was obviously work laid down, but it was like fuel to the fire. And somebody in our Discord said something very interesting, where they were like, I'm very happy that people are becoming more aware, but I'm a little suspicious that when someone like John Oliver, Mr. Trump himself, is on there saying the same things as what used to be like very hardcore radical thought, it's just like, wait a minute, like why is he being allowed to say this? Like he is still part of like a corporate media. Why is he being allowed to say this? And I talked it over with some people. I think one thing that is fueling this is the U.S. doesn't care. Now, Amanda, tell me if this is like totally crazy, but my thinking is like the U.S. is thinking, the Middle East is kind of going to fade in our importance because our real target is China. And the problem with China, especially with like Xinjiang, is that America has almost no credibility when it comes to Muslim interests, because there's just the list of crimes is just so long, and at some and they don't want to, like, America doesn't want to give up Israel, obviously, or that foothold, but we gotta at least have some moral standing, and it's now in our interest to at least performatively, like Joe Biden will still sign like a trillion gazillion dollars, but we will have the squad come out and give their lip service about this and that, so that we can at least present this front, so that we will have at least some moral standing when we say accuse China of like Islamophobia and all that. That's kind of like the feeling I get. Like, and
I don't know. So I think like I want to say that like even with AOC and Rashida Tlaib, what they're saying, it's still like to the right of what Palestinian organizers have been saying for a long time. So it might seem radical to some people because we're not used to like politicians acknowledging apartheid and ethnic cleansing. But I mean, like AOC still has yet to come out in support of BDS. And BDS, this is the campaign that has like been ongoing for years. And this is like the one thing that Palestinians have like asked us to do to participate in. And she still hasn't come out in favor of that. So I think like, it may seem like these politicians, like another thing I want to like point out is, I'm like pretty skeptical of politicians, like you all know that. I'm not going to praise these politicians for saying like these very obvious things, because if you like track AOC's position on Palestine, it was like really, really bad in the beginning, and she's like slowly gotten better, but it's not like out of the goodness of her heart or anything like that, or like moral clarity. It's because of public pressure and organizers like pressuring her, pressing her, and condemning like previous statements that she's put out. So
didn't she have some really like sketchy position on Venezuela though? I remember her, like I know very little about that issue.
What she said was that she sort of deferred to Democratic Party leadership on the issue of Venezuela, which was, sanctions. So it was like a de facto imperialist position.
Right. So that's what makes me suspicious of people like her. Like, why are you allowed to move on Israel? And my like suspicion is because the real target is to criticize China down the road. And you can't do that if you are too pro-Israel, because they'll just be like, well, what about the Palestinians? Because China, actually, I looked up all the countries that recognize Palestine and the ones who don't. It's very stark. It's very obvious which countries do and do not. It's like all the like Western, like America, Canada, Australia, Western Europe, like East Asia, like Japan and Korea, all the American allies, all either don't recognize Palestine or it's just like whatever. And the African countries like China and Russia, they all recognize Palestine. So Jess from Plan A told us to talk about this, but is another of this like support for Palestine, is it kind of like a proxy battle just for greater dissatisfaction with the US, or just like Western leadership just being like, this used to be the sacred cow that we could not criticize, but now we're going to come after it. We may not know all the details, but it seems like one side is a nuclear power that's fully supported by the US. You're killing and doing all this massacring of kind of like helpless refugees. So we're gonna come out and criticize you for it. Like, how much of it do you think is that as well?
I'm not really sure, but does someone else want to take that question?
I think for me, that's part of it is that the reason the both sidesing stuff that was coming out was really pissing me off was like, I think one big difference is that that Israel honestly it seems like they've gotten even more craven this time around with what they're doing. It's fucking nuts. Like the pictures are like fucking crazy. Number two though is that the both sidesing thing is kind of bullshit, because I'm like, everyone knows that we're supporting Israel to like, the tune of like $4+ billion a year. So how can you both sides it when you're supporting, like, where's the $4 billion to the Palestinians? Like, I would accept the both sidesing thing is if we're supporting both sides equally or totally out of it. And I personally would be happier to stay out of it as an American. But to know that the U.S. is basically subsidizing this assault, and it's our weapons and our money. I'm like, I'm a fucking U.S. taxpayer. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I get a say in this. That's why all these boxing out arguments kind of, saying like, oh, what's your involvement? Do you understand the history here? I was like, I don't know. I personally, Amanda, I'm not, I don't know the Middle East history nearly as well as someone who's studied it like you or whatever. But I guess as an American, it's like, because of our complicity there, I don't think it's limited to just people that have like some sort of deep personal connection to the area. But as an American, I'm like, yo, we're sending missiles and planes and shit over there.
Yeah.
That's my tax money, yo. I want some fucking healthcare. I don't want this shit. What is this stuff?
Yeah, I think that's, I think that's a good point. We should care about it because we are complicit in this like ongoing ethnic cleansing. Our tax dollars fund it, and our government like fully supports and backs it.
Yeah, they just approved the $735 million.
Yeah. In addition,
in the
to
middle
the
of all
billion.
this,
Yeah.
In the middle of all
here's
this.
$735 million worth of new weaponry.
Yeah, and it really is one of
During
those
inflation
things where you're
crisis.
like, how fucking powerful is this APAC lobby where
Yeah.
we're literally seeing like images of fucking dead children. Like, even if you're not really that serious or committed to the issue, like me, like someone like me, honestly, like, how craven is it that in the middle of this you would still knock down a democratic proposal to be like, yo, can you just table the military spend bill till maybe later when not everyone's watching? And Biden was like, nope,
Right.
we got to do it now. And probably because Netanyahu told him you got to do it now. Okay, you know what's really worth watching? I was doing a little research for this, and then I went in when was the original, when they were starting to, when Obama was first gearing up to sign that JCPOA deal with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal. And Netanyahu really, really opposed it, right? He really was against any sense of the United States and Iran trying to normalize things. So he went to Congress and gave a speech to Congress telling them to oppose the president. Like, I was like, holy shit, that's crazy.
That was crazy.
Like,
I remember.
Like
That was
a foreign leader coming to tell the U.S. Congress to oppose the U.S. president. But they had him, and I watched the speech, and it was absolutely incredible. The way that Netanyahu was like basically telling them that like we're so close, like Israel and the United States, like we're so together at such a deep level that he actually said that there are things, and this was trying to soften the blow to Obama, right? To be a little diplomatic. He was like, there are things that Obama has done for Israel that the American people will never be allowed to know, but I know, because that's how tight the U.S. president and Israeli prime minister are. Meaning, there are things that your own people can't come between the two of us. And I'm watching this speech, and I'm like, holy shit, because I never really paid attention, but I'm like, this is just openly to a joint session of Congress. It was one of the craziest speeches I've ever seen, especially looking in hindsight. But yeah, it's kind of how it goes with it's almost like we're the same country.
Well,
you know what I mean?
It makes me wonder, right? Because we talk about the $4 billion a year or so that we give to Israel. And then we're talking about a $735 million sale. How much of that sale is just us buying our own weapons with the money that we gave them? So it's like...
Yeah, it's a direct... You're just sending out weapons to them, yeah.
Yeah, just basically saying, here are the weapons for free, but give us this money so we can give it to our defense contractors, right? So it's just sort of like this Ouroboros of like money, this direct military-industrial complex, right? It's kind of crazy to think about.
Part of it, if you watch that speech, part of it is, I don't know if Netanyahu actually is a very, he's like actually a very charismatic character. He was like a special ops commando back in the day. And Oh wait, hold on. Let me continue. I got to kind of deal with something. Plumbing issue.
Oh yeah, I was like,
Real world.
That's not your girlfriend. All right. Okay. So one thing that's been running through my mind is like, what's motivating all these people? Because I think when you have such a large group of people coming out to support something, you're gonna have various factions, various motivations. And I'm wondering how many of these people are here because their stance is anti-interventionist. Teen and I talked about this in the last bonus pod for Escape from Plan A. Is that are they saying the U.S. This is wrong because we're funding this wrongdoing and our action should be don't do this anymore? Like the reason this is wrong is because we're implicated, we're involved in this. Versus how many people are like, no, this is a crime going on in the world, and the U.S. has to intervene on the side of justice, because I think that gets into like a dangerous territory where
I have to say, so I've been to a lot of these rallies and marches. I don't think that line is so prevalent.
Okay, well, that's good to hear.
What is most prevalent is like a support for Palestinian self-determination and an end to the occupation, but also the Palestinian right of return, and a solution to the issue, the conflict, the issue, which would ensure right of return and Palestinians living in with democratic rights, which we might as well go into. So I don't know how much you all know about the two-state solution.
Pretty much nothing. So
okay. So on the international stage, what a lot of politicians will kind of throw out as a solution is what they call a two-state solution. Two-state solution being Israel and then Palestine would be the West Bank and Gaza. But if you look at that series of maps that you showed in the beginning, you see with all the settlements that the West Bank looks like Swiss cheese, right? It's barely
it's not
contiguous.
Neatly,
Yeah.
It's not a neat grid or anything.
Yeah, that's what it looks like with all of the land that Israel has seized for settlements. So you have this area of land, barely contiguous patches of land, and then Gaza, which is completely disconnected from it. So how do you create a viable state out of barely contiguous or non-contiguous patches of land? So the two-state solution is just political theater. It's been dead for decades, but it's just this sort of farce that the international community kind of pays lip service to, so that Israel can continue annexing more land, creating more settlements, and it's been dead for a couple of decades now.
Yeah. So just sorry, I was searching frantically for a map to show that, but this is actually a zoomed in version. This is zoomed in. The maps we were showing before showed all of Israel. This is sort of zoomed in to show the West Bank and Gaza. But I think most importantly, to Amanda's point, you can see that they're not connected by anything. There's no sort of even thin strip of land that connects the two. They're completely non-contiguous.
That's what I was saying. If you look at the map, a lot of those islands, they stop where there's a valley. So any sort of low-lying usable land is kind of taken away, and they're just sort of
go back to that first image that you showed.
Yeah, I'll show that one.
Yeah, it had the.
Yeah, 1 second.
The one over the 4 different maps.
Yeah. Because I think that shows it a little bit better.
This is guaranteed to be a stupid question, but has anyone proposed making it neater, just being let's make it all contiguous, everyone on one side, everyone on the other side?
No, that would mean that they would kick settlers out, and
Yeah.
there's no way they would do that.
Yeah, it would be,
See,
too
look at
traumatic for everyone.
it's just little islands of land with all of the settlements. It's how do you create a state out of that? So really, so what's
Yeah.
happening
So this is.
is
Yeah.
there's a one state solution. So either it's going to be a one state solution, which is Israel continues its policies of apartheid and ethnic cleansing until eventually it like annexes all of the land and the Palestinians are just gone and it's all Israel, which is like sort of the de facto policy in place right now. Or you have like a one state solution in the form of a secular state where Palestinians have the right of return and everyone has equal democratic rights under one state. Of course, Israel does not want that because in order for Israel to be Israel, it has to maintain its Jewish demographic majority, right? This is why it's like implementing these systems of apartheid and ethnic
Right.
cleansing because it needs those to maintain its Jewish demographic majority.
What's the ratio of Israeli citizens, Israeli Jewish citizens versus non Jewish citizens and other
not-
residents?
Oh, I'm not really sure.
Because you mentioned that there were about 2 million Palestinians in Gaza,
There are
right,
2
as a
million.
whole.
Yeah.
And that's not even counting the West Bank. I just wonder whether the ratio, I just wonder what the ratio is because, but be that as it may, I agree that Israel, the political powers that control Israel are not going to want any sort of one state solution where they're not in complete control.
Yeah.
Though
It's not gonna happen.
this is, I mean, to be clear, this isn't. There are such things as moderate and liberal voices in Israel and in Jewish diaspora outside of Israel that,
Oh, yeah.
as opposed to what's going on, right? It's not like, I mean, I've heard, for example, Netanyahu. This is a sort of desperate attempt on him to activate extremists because his grip on power in Israel is actually kind of weak, and so. I don't know. It should be. I mean, to be honest, like I actually found that a lot of Israeli media is covering this better than U.S. media. Like I read like stories in Haaretz or Times of Israel that are actually better and less spun than stuff in New York Times.
They have better
Yeah.
headlines, at least, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not. It's far from saying like, oh, this is the will of all Israeli people or of all Jewish people.
That was not my.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
didn't want to imply that. I'm just saying
Yeah.
that.
But
No. I'm
That-
just saying to
something
note
though,
that. Yeah.
like even like the moderate voices, they will say Israel has a right to exist. That is like the moderate position. Even liberal Zionism will be like Israel has a right to exist, and that is a talking point that we've all come to accept naturally. But Israel is predicated on like land theft, elimination of the Palestinian population. Like that's the contradiction here, right? It's either it's the Israeli state versus Palestinian liberation. You cannot have both because in order for Israel to exist, it has to have that Jewish majority demographic. So I think we should all question like that common talking point. Like Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Not if it has to like implement these policies in order for it to exist as a Jewish majority.
Oh, this was the tweet where there was someone who was like, okay, so then you're saying that the United States doesn't have a right to exist? And you're like,
People think that would be. Some people think that people would be like, no, of course not. I'm like, actually,
yeah.
maybe we don't. We probably don't. I mean, if you want.
Well, it wasn't a good beginning, and it's
Yeah.
not a good present. So
And Amanda, you're talking about how basically, if you take that line of reasoning about how we're one country, Israel, was only founded because of land theft and in sort of imperial power, right? That's America,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
We stole land and we took it by force.
I think there is a connection there in terms of. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Before I had to deal with my plumbing issue.
We hope that's okay now.
Going back to this Netanyahu speech, I want to say first, Netanyahu is a very charismatic person. He used to be a macho kind of guy. He's a brash talker. He doesn't mince words. He was a commando, and he took part in that. Was it in Uganda that military operation, the commando operation, where they hijacked a plane, they flew to Uganda, and his brother was killed. And he's a fucking war hero, right? And he comes to Congress, and it's almost like having this legendary general from the outposts of the furthest.
You're talking about the American
Rome.
Congress, right?
Yes, yeah.
No, he came in front of Congress.
Didn't the Republicans invite him to spite Obama?
Yes,
pretty much.
Yeah, exactly. But both sides showed up, and both sides. You'll never see Congress come together in such a bipartisan round of applause
Especially
you would get,
leader.
like Netanyahu would get. No American president receives the kind of applause that Netanyahu got that day, and it was almost like watching a glorious general from the outposts of Rome fighting the Gauls or something coming back, and the Senate just applauding this war hero. And he tells this very simple story. And he was like, Iran is an evil fucking country, okay? It's simple. You guys are the good guys. It's so simple. He's like, don't believe these people who tell you otherwise, because your constitution talks about freedom and liberty, and their constitution talks about hatred and killing, okay? So this is definitely good versus evil. And he doesn't fuck around with kind of both sides in language. He's a very one-sided guy. Hey, what's up, John?
Hey.
And I gotta say, you could see the people in Congress just captivated by this man who isn't held back by the same, the same sort of talking out of both sides that most American politicians do. This guy was coming in and demanding that, my God, I am on the front lines. And let me tell you, it's worse than you people say. It's so much worse. And we need your help. And you've always been there for us. You've always been there for Israel from the very beginning. And we need you there now. So don't fuck this up. And don't start getting cozy with the enemy. Because let me tell you, the Persians are the fucking enemy. And he was going back. He was citing ancient history about how evil the Persians are. And you could see it just gave the Americans this sort of spark of purpose and mission. That is missing.
But there was an article I read some time ago. It was apparently there was some meeting, let's say between the Israeli ambassador and in Australia or something. Apparently he said to this Australian guy, we're brothers in arms as nations, because we are essentially white Western nations surrounded by kind of a non-white, more barbaric horde. And America, from its founding, you think about the centuries plus wars they had with the Native Americans and all that. Yeah, it runs in the national narrative that we are on the frontier. We carved out this superior nation by taking land from the lesser peoples who were, it was this beautiful land was wasted on them.
Mm-hmm.
And
so that's a really common, I forgot to mention when I was talking about, sorry to interrupt you, Chris.
Oh, no, I was done, yeah.
But I forgot to mention when I was, in the beginning when I was talking about the creation of Israel, when the settlers came, they said very similar things as the American settlers, that the land was uninhabited. There was no one there, or the people there, they didn't know how to use the land properly or as well as they could. And so what, this common saying among Israelis is that they came and made the desert bloom. So it's this very common settler colonial language.
Yeah, that's very common with what happened in the United States as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was this weird tweet by Ro Khanna, which was just it was something so absurd, but it was something
the guy from California.
Yeah, he's a congressman, right?
The Justice Democrat.
I don't think so. I think he's he's
a DSA guy, isn't he?
No, I think I don't know too much about it. I think he's kind of tried to slide that way, but I don't think he started off that way. I think he started off as a Silicon Valley.
He's a Silicon Valley guy.
That's his background. And and he tweeted something somebody was telling him why do you what's the difference between Israel and Saudi Arabia? And the first thing he cited about what made Israel worth defending was that it has a startup culture. It was one of the most bizarre things I've seen a politician. And then he said something like, they have a startup culture and
Makes sense from
their
his background.
democracy and defend human rights. But it seemed like he prioritized the startup culture more. It was so weird.
Was that a
That is
reference
a human
to like
right.
their tech industry, or how the society is like everybody on board?
I think he means tech industry, like
He
literally.
means that. Yeah, he means
Because
Yeah,
they have a
yeah.
ton of startups there, and
and I think it goes to this thing about like, well, Israel is far more advanced and civilized than any of the backwards, despotic, Arab
Right.
Muslim countries around it. It's like, oh, it's doing so well. It has such a good, thriving, technological sector. I'm sure it's helped by the massive amounts of American aid and all that. It's more liberal. I saw the woke angle being used. Like, in say Saudi Arabia, women can't drive. In Israel, there's gay marriage. I don't know if there is, but for example, something like that.
That's a really common. So the Zionists in the state of Israel have like sort of waged this like liberal human rights campaign. Like academics and activists call it pink washing, where they portray Israel as this beacon of human rights and liberalism in this barbaric Middle East. And so they've like sort of waged these PR campaigns where they talk about how queer people are welcomed in Israel, how queer people are able to serve in the IDF. And they contrast that with like the supposed homophobia that exists in Palestine, pinkwashing, and
US
it's a way
Army.
of justifying its existence.
Why is it called pinkwashing? Is it because
Pink as in like gay, right?
more feminine or
It's
more.
more
Yeah,
I thought it
gay.
was like a reference to feminism, but
I thought so
Probably.
too.
Yeah.
Okay, I was just curious.
Yeah, I've seen really weird sort of pinkwashing stuff where they basically they try to draw the distinction between I think Palestinians who are backwards and not woke versus the Israelis that are let women whatever into the military, and then I saw recently like someone sort of saying, well, could you imagine? It was like a tweet. And someone was like, could you imagine being a macho Hamas fighter and being killed by, getting your asses kicked by these women? And it's sort of like, this sort of prettied up IDF.
They did that.
women
They did that
soldiers.
to Taiwan. They did this to Taiwan, saying Taiwan
yeah.
was the first place in East Asia to legalize same-sex marriage, and this was a indication that this made Taiwan civilizationally compatible
Yeah.
with the U.S.
Yeah.
Which is funny because the U.S. had we never legalized it except through a court decision pretty recently, right?
Yeah.
So we never even passed legislation around it. We just had a judge do it. But yeah, I feel like ever since the U.S. Since the Supreme Court came down on that and sort of legalized it without legislation, meaning we didn't have to do it ourselves. That has been a very useful thing because now we can go around saying, "Hey, we know about the homophobia. We know about which countries are backwards. And it's I don't know. When I've seen it applied to Taiwan, it just felt like complete bullshit. I was like, I don't even think it would really pass Congress, to be honest.
You know,
in the
people
U.S. It had to be
people
a court
often
case.
gloss over. Like there was that one comment about how there was hot Israeli women being promoted in the military. That the right wingers ate that shit up so hard.
Oh yeah, they love that.
Conveniently, we don't talk about. There was the all women fighting force in the Middle East. I forget what country, but they were kicking ass.
In Libya?
I think
no,
so.
it's not that
perhaps.
thing that Hillary Clinton's making a movie about, is it?
I don't
I think they're
know.
Kurds.
Perhaps. I hope. I mean, what are you gonna do if she's gonna make a movie about it? They're still badass.
They're still badass.
Yeah, that doesn't take away from them at all. I think my memory is terrible. I'm sorry, but I think in Vietnam there were also a lot of women took up arms.
Oh yeah.
Throughout history, in revolutions, women have played a huge role in them as fighters and in all sorts of ways, and that just gets glossed over all the time. It's not at all it's just a post-rationalization of our colonialism. It's not. At the end of the day, for me, it's really simple. We need a foothold in the Middle East to project military power, and every other
Yep.
justification comes on the heels of that. Everything else is just fluff.
Okay, tough question time for Amanda. Because
I can't
so,
promise that I'll be able to answer it, but
but I need an answer because I don't know because it's the same question applies to me. Though Chris and we've talked about this, and I think I understand this better now. But I think it's a legitimate question, right? Which is, okay, well, let's talk about me, right? I tweet all day about how this is bullshit. The China Watcher discussion about Xinjiang is bullshit. That there's a lot of manufactured claims about what's going on and the Uyghur genocide, which Blinken has backed, meaning that they have not backed down from what Pompeo did under Trump to say that there is a genocide of Uyghur Muslims in China. And I think that's bullshit. And I think that a lot of that is manufactured for other political ulterior purposes. But there is an accusation that by taking that position, that means that it is inconsistent or contradictory to caring about the plight of Palestinians in Israel, because they're saying the Uyghurs, they're the Palestinians of Xinjiang in China. So why is it that in that domain you don't have any sympathy for the Uyghurs, but in this domain you suddenly care about the Palestinians? And I don't mean that tough for you, like explain yourself, because I take that position too.
yeah.
But I do think it's a fair question, at least at the surface. You know what I mean?
Because
has anyone
well,
challenged
for
you on that?
one,
Or
I
Yeah.
mean, I've seen it, but
Yeah.
for one, the oppression of Palestinians is well documented, well known. It is a fact. They are living under apartheid and ethnic cleansing. That is a fact. That is undeniable. You can't deny it. The Uyghur situation, the evidence around that is a little bit murkier. And you could we've all made the point that it's part of a propaganda campaign against China. So, this idea that I personally don't think that there is a genocide going on. I think that whether or that doesn't mean that there's nothing going on, right? You can make the claim that it's a really heavy-handed assimilationist campaign, and they're under heavy surveillance. But our tax dollars are not going to that. We are not. Our tax dollars are directly going to Israel. Our government backs Israel. So we are complicit in that. So the Uyghur situation, that is an internal China affair. And we do not have any sort of say in that, whereas we do have a say in what's going on in Palestine. We can demand our government stop giving money to Israel, stop backing it. We can support BDS. So we can control what our government does, and we can more easily change this policy. Whereas the Uyghur situation, that's an internal Chinese affair, and we have really no control over it whatsoever.
Right. I agree with that.
Yeah, I mean that's why I asked about the motives of the people who are coming out to this. Is it interventionist, or is it actually more of a crusaderist a motive from a more progressive side that might say something like, the error into going Libya wasn't the fact that we went at all, but it was the wrong call. So I think the better take is the anti-interventionist take, which is just, it's wrong because we're involved, and it's not our job to, police. It's not our job to go into the South China Sea and defend this or that because we
Right, the
think
occupation
it's
of Palestine, like that would be impossible without U.S. support and U.S. funding. You know, do you know how many human rights violations and international laws Israel has violated, and like they face no consequences because of the U.S.
Yeah.
The U.S. was the one who, I think they were people at the UN were calling for a ceasefire recently.
Yeah, we've blocked it 3 times.
We blocked it 3 times. This wouldn't be able to happen.
The only country on the security, everyone else, all other 13 countries,
Yeah.
were like, no, we're supporting it. Only the U.S. blocked it 3
Yeah.
times. Crazy.
Yeah.
This is the thing about the liberal point of view on this is starting to piss me off really bad because it's and I think this is the hallmark of a liberal position, which is as the liberal, I don't have a position. I'm above all of this. I just opine on everything equally. In every case, I have my liberal position and I think that this is right, that's wrong, or whatever. And I demand consistency and I demand everything, and it's the liberal is so disembodied from who they actually are. And I think, Chris and I were trying to work out, what is a consistent position as an Asian American to take on this stuff? Mm-hmm. And I think it has to do with the fact that we're living in America, and your primary responsibility is to rein in your own state and to control what it is that your state does, not to go around and offer your fucking position on everything around the world. And it's the one big taboo, that one thing that a liberal will never accept is the not caring. Honestly,
Oh, yeah.
the thing is I don't really give a shit about what's going on in Xinjiang because we're not active there. That's not, CNN can't even locate that shit on a map. Okay, nobody even knows where it is. So why all of a sudden are we caring? And obviously there's ulterior motives. There's reasons for that. It's because they want to use it as a pretext for more interventionist policies and ramping up this bullshit Cold War. And I don't want that as an American. And now they're saying with Israel, they're like, oh yeah, stay out of it because, all these, you're messing with things that are well beyond your pay grade, and you can't say anything about Israel because that's anti-Semitic and you don't know what the fuck you're talking about. And I'm like, fuck, I don't need to fucking know. I'm like, I see what's going on. I read what's going on. Apparently it's my fucking tax dollars that's paying for this shit, and I don't like it. Mm-hmm. So this constant test, I think, with liberals as to what are your qualifications? They're always asking you, what are your qualifications to have an opinion here? My fucking qualification is that I'm an American and I know what the fuck is up with what we're trying to do. So fuck it.
Okay, I'm going to address this comment that was recently just dropped in the comments. Sorry to interrupt you, Teen. Are you finished?
I'm always finished. Yeah.
Feel free to no, I'm kidding.
It says free Palestine from Hamas.
I was going to ignore that, but if you want to.
Okay.
Go for it.
Palestinians have a right of self-defense, and Hamas has been a formidable resistance against Israeli occupation. You might not like Hamas, you might not agree with them politically, and Palestinians may not all agree with Hamas politically, but they are pretty much all united in their support, in their resistance against Israeli occupation.
Yeah.
Palestinians as a whole, and that includes PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
I think this is
those are
yummier.
2 communist organizations.
Wait, why should we be free from hummus? It's delicious.
Well, it's in
easy to
opposition
It's
to
a
that.
similar thing to
Nutritious.
free Chinese from their government. We hate
Right.
we love the Chinese. We hate their
Yeah,
government.
it's savior white savior complex
Yeah.
for someone
Yeah.
else.
Yeah, and if you want to call on any group of people to sort of free themselves, talk about the Israelis and their government. And
That's
their
another
leaders.
thing. I do think
okay?
people-
So talk to them about electing new people, all right?
That's another thing is I know Hamas has been involved in violent struggle, and that's how shit works. That's
Yeah.
the thing. That's how
it's-
fucking
Assumes that
self-defense works.
Palestinians can like liberate themselves just through peaceful marches? No. How was Algeria liberated?
yeah.
This is
You
the
think
same
they
fucking.
asked the French nicely
How about
to
Haiti,
leave?
right? Haiti was they asked their colonizers and slave
How about
masters to like just
America?
How about in
please let us,
America? Well, I mean,
Yeah.
here's the thing that I thought was really
Yeah, I don't
interesting
know,
as
it's
an American
ridiculous.
that I learned recently, just watching the events. Minneapolis was one of the most violent uprisings that I'd seen in a long time. They fucking booted the cops out of their own precinct and then burned that shit to the ground. That's what they did. And everyone was like, oh,
my God,
shit.
yeah.
And guess what happened? The Minneapolis Police Department testified against Chauvin. They got what they wanted because they were like, look, that's a fucking public building. The public paid for that building, and now we're going to take it back. We're going to burn it down. Fuck you. And it worked. And I have to say, like, I am not always so comfortable watching these events, honestly, as an American.
Sure.
They're a little scary, but look at the outcome. I'm like, I'm sorry, but it is not places like New York where people were taking a knee with the cops and doing kumbaya with the chief of police where we got results. It was in Minneapolis where they burned the fucking police station down that they got results. And so, I don't know, would you say that to like, you know, the protest movement here, like, oh, free black people from BLM, or, you know, like, would you say shit like that? Because, you know, all these people going around saying like, oh yeah, I don't condone violence of any sort. I'm sorry, but that's, if you say that, I feel like it's just saying you live in a world where violence underwrites the current configuration of power. And so if you say I oppose violence of any means, you're basically saying you can never fight back.
Is it
Fuck
not
you.
just another case of the moderate,
Yeah.
what is it, the moderate whites that MLK was talking about? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with your mission, but not your methods. You know.
Yeah, you're not allowed to do
Simply-
anything about it.
Well, I
Right,
think
it's just reaction to that.
I think Ayanna Pressley, you know, when she was giving a speech recently in Congress, was talking about how, you know, black Americans are not allowed any sort of, you know, they can't fight back against their oppression in any way that's acceptable, and that's what these people who are saying both sides or it's the same talk, right? It's like,
Yeah.
well, you can't do anything to protect yourself.
This
Yeah,
coming
we're
from a
finding that in
country,
Asia.
this coming from a country where in a lot of states, I can literally like blow the head off of anyone that walks into my property
Yeah.
in self-defense. That's totally fine. That kind of violence is fine.
And
You know,
Adam, to your
the-
point, it's the same thing that's happening to the Asian American community, right? We're
Yeah.
not allowed. There's no right way.
There's no
for us to
acceptable
defend ourselves
method
or-
of fighting back,
Yeah,
of
we're wrong
standing
for
up for
setting up
yourself. There's you
patrols,
can't do
we're
it.
wrong
You can't
for-
do it.
Oh, you can take a knee with the cops and
Yeah.
stuff, and you can do a dance off.
Right. Well, not
But-
no effective means of fighting back.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah.
know. I think there's this need for the victim to be perfect, a perfect victim,
Right.
and to look pathetic so that other people can use you as an icon for their own agenda, but you can't fight back.
No.
I can use your image to advance whatever it is I want, but
Yep.
the second you put a rock in your hand, oh, you crossed the line, buddy.
Yeah.
Fuck that.
The smart guided missiles that, you know, I can pinpoint a mouse in a field from orbit. Those are totally totally okay. But if you put a rock in your hand or anything like that, you're the problem now.
Speaking of
insane.
rockets, there was a very, let's say, oddly worded headline that says something like, Hamas was sending suicide drones into
Every missile's a
Israel.
suicide missile.
So, yeah, you know, warhead lives matter, guys. Those
Yeah.
warheads have feelings. Yeah.
Ah, so weird.
Anyway, so can you tell us a little bit about like the sort of what you've seen on the ground in terms of like the protests, and does it feel like there's like a real movement here, kind of like what we've seen in the wake of say George Floyd and things like that?
I think so. Yeah. I feel like the shift. It's shifting, and what's happening in Palestine. I think we're like. I mean, I don't want to get too optimistic, but I think we're like heading into like a third intifada. I can't really see things like returning to normal or whatever that is after all that's like occurred in the past couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So it'll be really interesting to watch.
Yeah. And the U.S. has lost. It seems like the Biden has just zero control or influence over what's going on, like
Yeah.
none.
Oh, it seemed like they had completely taken their eye off the ball of the Middle East. They were so obsessed with China that like the Middle East,
Yeah.
that Afghanistan thing. He's like, we're pulling out. This is very like 2000s. Let's let it go. And it's like, oh shit, things still we didn't solve that problem there after all. Yeah. So.
I mean, what's
Isn't he still trying to work out like a position? Like he doesn't really know what to. I don't know.
I think that Biden is basically completely powerless here. He has no influence or control over what Netanyahu or in the IDF and the generals want to do. So he can't make any demands because they're just going to ignore it. So the only thing he can do is just keep it vague and pretend like they're
Right.
working with the Israelis on some kind of plan. But
It was
it's
like,
just
oh,
to
yeah,
save
I told you to
face.
do that. Yeah, they're listening
Yeah.
to me. Yeah.
Exactly.
But,
Yeah, exactly.
But I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot too much, Amanda. But how do you feel? What do you think is going to happen, or how do you think it's going to develop? Because I mean, right now, at least the last thing that I know is going on is that the Israeli military is continuing to send their missiles, continuing to do incursions on the ground, things like that. Yeah. Palestinians and other people in Gaza are fighting back as they can. What do you think the next stage of this will be?
So what's really been interesting is that like Hamas has been like firing missiles at Israel, but in the West Bank, the
Right.
Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade has like reformed. And so they have been present in the West Bank, and I think they like kicked a bunch of soldiers out of a Palestinian town. I forget, or in a Palestinian town in the West Bank. I think it was Nablus. I'm not sure. So they're taking up armed resistance against the occupation. So as I said, like a few minutes ago, this could be the beginning of a third intifada. And I don't know. I have
you
a
think
little
that-
bit of revolutionary optimism here.
Do you think that there's a chance that some of the countries sort of, in the region, start to get involved in some way? Probably not in a big military way, but, sending resources in any clandestine fashion, manpower, allowing, refugees even. Do you think there's any chance of that developing, or is it just going to be a little bit more of the homegrown or, the groups within the West Bank and Gaza reforming or getting stronger?
I mean, like, I could see. Oh, well, I don't really know. I was gonna.
Yeah,
say,
no, it's a tough question. I don't mean
Yeah,
to.
I was gonna say like maybe Iran would send like weapons to Hamas, but do they really want to like get involved?
Yeah, that's the
with
question,
Israel?
right?
Yeah.
Because as soon as the last sort of armed conflict between Israel and other countries in the region was in the 70s.
Yes, in the 70s.
Yeah, and since then there's been no, it's sort of just quiet on that front, and it's just sort of Israel doing their thing as we've talked about within their borders. But I saw a report that people were seeing, maybe these were just Palestinians that had moved to Jordan, going back over the border into into Israel.
Yeah.
So I don't know necessarily what that means, but do you think there's it seems to me that maybe there's a chance that Palestinian diaspora that's in the region or neighboring countries, maybe there's some push there. Well, I mean,
it's not going to come from Jordan because Jordan's basically like
Right.
A U.S. client state. The monarchy that they have there, that was like installed by the British after World War II.
okay.
Syria, they're not going to get involved because they have their own issues right now. I don't really know, and I can't really predict what's going to happen next. But all support to the Palestinian resistance.
Just as a question, what's Netanyahu got on America that earns him this level of control?
So I don't really agree with this idea that Israel controls America. I think there would be no support for Israel if Israel wasn't in the strategic place that it is, and it occupies like this strategic foothold for the United States and secures its own interests there.
Yeah.
Because like the second it didn't, like the U.S. would just like turn on it and abandon
Like Haiti,
it. So yeah, I don't think it's a situation of the tail wagging the dog there. Yeah, I just think, like I said earlier, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests, and that's the role that Israel occupies for the U.S.
Yeah, that said, I
That
do
makes
think,
sense
I mean,
to
going
me.
back to this thing, though, I do think that Netanyahu has doesn't have the same constraints that American politicians have in terms of speaking openly about national survival and who is the enemy and just outright. I mean, yeah, we paint Iran as an evil country, but I've never seen anyone in the U.S. even go approach the level that Netanyahu can do. And I do think that he presents something that's very attractive to American politicians. So I agree with you. I don't think it's Israel has some sort of controlling power, or Netanyahu has controlling power over America in terms of our interests. But I do think that he presents a vision of the world that is very appealing to American leaders about there just being a very simple good versus evil confrontation going on. I think it just makes it makes them feel like they're on a really important mission from God, that they're just doing the right. This is about my life has a simple story to it, and our exercise of power has a simple purpose to it. And you feel like a hero, right? You feel like and you can do something. Like, we have all these weapons, we have all this money, we could do something. So I think it's just, I don't know, it's just very. I felt I'll say this, I understood the appeal, because if what he were saying was true, like if you didn't know what was going on and you just took him at face value, it's such an organizing like principle for the U.S. to follow. Like, there's these evil Persians who are hell bent on spreading, violence and chaos and terror around the world, and America must stop them. Simple as that. And if it's that simple, then we don't have to have all these fights about whatever. So.
Yeah, to address the comment on the screen, there was U.S. and Israel supported apartheid South Africa long after, other countries came out in opposition to it. It was because of both of those that it was able to survive for so long.
Was that
Did
just
they
like pure
also-
racism, or did they want resources from there? Because I mean, like, the southern tip of Africa is not as strategic a location as the Middle East. So I mean, what was the U.S.'s? What was their problem?
I don't know. I can.
Well, let's work it out. Like, what the? I mean, maybe one of the commenters can tell us, like, what the hell would the U.S. have?
What was
Like-
Musk's family's the whole thing? They were mining something, right?
Emeralds.
Emeralds? Okay.
Emeralds are not really a strategic resource. I don't think they have an
South
industrial
Africa has
use.
gold. It's got diamonds. Probably has a lot of natural resources, but it's like.
Does South Africa itself?
Wasn't Nelson Mandela officially like a terrorist in the American? Americans
Probably.
labeled him a terrorist
Probably.
until like
Now we
2008 or
pretend
something.
we always loved him, Uncle Nelson, we always loved him, but it's like,
Yeah,
he
it's
was still
interesting.
labeled
I
a
don't know,
terrorist
but
until
yeah.
fairly recently.
I don't know that much about apartheid South Africa or the strategic use.
Well, the ANC was like Hamas. It was considered a terrorist group. And
Sure.
It wasn't until later where we kind of changed our position because of
it might have been
history.
a Cold War thing, yeah.
I will say
Yeah, but-
I got very mixed impressions of Mandela as a child growing up in Berkeley. Like, some people would be like, "Yeah, Mandela," and other people were like, "Fuck Mandela," and I had no clue. I was like 7.
I always heard that he was like a good guy, but it's not like I was bombarded with messages by him. But he was like, he's like Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr. He was in that. Like,
Yeah, that
pantheon.
seems like post, like after the fact, sort of praising of people that they really hated at the time, right? Sort of like MLK. So GW said that Israel gave South Africa their nuke. So maybe that was a reason.
Wait, South Africa's a nuclear nation?
Well, I think at the time they weren't, but Israel was a nuclear nation, and then if this is correct, then Israel gave South Africa the nuke. So, yeah, I guess they were.
Just one. Just gave them. Here you go.
You can only use it once, so they could take good care of it.
Yeah, that makes sense too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Oh, that's just like with Australia. They're all fucking the same. They're all the fucking same. Man.
They are all the fucking same. You're right.
That's the other thing is like you're dealing with nuclear power against. That's like sort of the big backdrop thing here that he keeps talking about, Netanyahu. I mean, if that's one of the things that he has to draw is like Iran is so close to tipping the scales because they're so close to getting the bomb, and once they get the bomb, it's all over. But I think big part of that is Israel has a nuclear weapon, at least, right? So like we're kind of trying to preserve Israel's sort of nuclear supremacy in the area.
So I just looked it up real quick. I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm reading South Africa is the only country to have built nuclear weapons and then voluntarily dismantle them.
Yeah.
But they still have the nuclear tech.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's frightening.
Yeah. Hey, at least
Anyway.
they dismantled them, for what it's worth.
I mean, based on what Jess said and based on what Tina's been talking about and just coming to America and just like it's like telling these like bedtime stories to American politicians who just lap it all up. Israel's existence flatters the Western-led order. It is the it is also it atones for the worst of the West, the Holocaust and everything. So, as I said, if you look at who supports Israel, like who recognizes and doesn't recognize Palestine, it's so clear. It's like the dark nations. It's like the Africa, the non-U.S. allied Asian nations, like China, like a lot of Southeast Asia, I think. And I think when it comes to just like everyday people who don't know a lot about these issues, suddenly feeling very galvanized by this, I do think some of it is just like powered by this crumbling faith in just like
I was on
the
the
Western order.
I was on the train once, and there was this really like drunk white dude, and there were two Israeli tourists, and the drunk white dude kind of heard their accent, and he was like, "Oh, where you from?" He was getting in their face, "Where you from?" And they were from Israel, and he got into the most cringy thing about how Israelis were these amazing like warriors, and he was like, "I'm so impressed with the warrior spirit." And like, you guys are the true warriors and all this stuff. And I think that this is a common thing. I think Sacha Baron Cohen does a lot of good like trolling to uncover these attitudes that the American right wing has towards idealizing Israel as the ultimate right wing, like flex the power. Like they're unabashed about their use of power, and they're not corrupted by. Yeah. They're not corrupted by the liberalism in America.
Society, told
it's like
to,
their version
feel
of
bad
Japan,
for
kind of, except better and not cute.
Oh, I mean, Japan is a pacifist, state. I mean, like Israel is this
it's the
no
Chad
holds
version.
fucking barred, just we will fucking crush our enemies kind of thing, and we won't apologize for it. And I do think that American right wingers really lust after that reputation, that almost Sparta-like reputation. That
they long for that.
Israel has
Absolutely.
that image, of the Israeli commandos and all these stories of the Mossad and what they did, and I think that is a real appeal to the right wingers when it comes to what's going on, and all these images of just these openly fucking, genocidal acts of violence. It excites a lot of Americans, in my opinion, where they were like, yeah, fuck it. That's what we should be doing. Why are you even apologizing for it? Kill them all. It's really scary.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, I saw this tweet come across my timeline a couple of days ago where, it was like it was a pro-Palestinian protest. And the tweet was from the Zionist who tweeted out this like cut video of these Palestinian guys wearing with Palestinian flags tied around them, just like sort of hitting or like fighting against this white guy. And they tweeted out the caption was like, Palestinian attacks Jewish man with a bat. Also, the same Palestinian sexually assaulted a Jewish girl earlier. And like, you know, they had cut this clip, but the full clip, other people had like left in the comments. It turned out the guy that they were attacking was from the JDL, the Jewish Defense League, which is like this far right, racist like group that's like sort of akin to the Proud Boys. And so a lot of this racism, like, and the justifications for Zionism is based around like the specter of like a dangerous brown like terrorist. You know, that tweet itself was really racist. You know, like this like violent brown guy assaults, you know, this white girl. That's so it's a lot of it is just like those sort of racist depictions like that.
They exploit the racist stereotypes so that like people don't even question that it happened and they just accept the narrative. The same thing happens with there was like an account out there that takes like, you know, things happening around with that involve Asian or Asian looking people and they just attribute it to China, you know? And like I mean, I'm sure we're not surprised by that at all, but they just that's what they do, and a lot of people will just recontextualize things to fit whatever narrative they want to push and just edit things.
Yeah, there's also this weird this will be I sort of it's like
you've been saying let's wrap it up for like the last 15 minutes, Teen.
Sorry, I'll make a last point. I do think like just on that point that I've noticed, which is weird, is like the more fucking intense the power you use, like if you're using F-16s and guided weapons and Iron Dome missile shields and nuclear weapons and you know, really well armed military with tanks and all that, that's legitimate. That's legitimate violence. But if you're using like homemade rockets and slingshots and Molotov cocktails and all that, that's terrorism. It's really weird how when your violence gets to a certain level of advancement, it sort of like is self-legitimizing. That's a very weird thing to me, because I think that's what explains part of why we see these just crazy violent images of entire residential buildings being destroyed 9/11 style intentionally, and we're okay with it because it came from a plane.
Are we effectively just saying might makes right?
It like a certain level of industrialized, mechanized violence means it's an advanced kind of violence, and that's the okay kind of violence. That's legitimate. I mean, you know, official.
They're only able to have that level of power because they're like authorized somehow, or they're justified.
Yeah, I was going to say, could people think, well, they must have used this such horrific violence. They had to do it like for a good reason, and then maybe if you just pick up a stone and throw it, that was like not for a good reason. That was just.
I think it also implies a certain amount of like momentum or like popular support behind you. You know, that's an organization. It involves.
It's official. It's been legitimized. And it's official, and that's the power of a state. And the Gazans are not afforded that because they don't have a fucking state.
Right.
You know,
so that's why it's like a mob. You know, it's a mob mentality.
Yeah. How long until the Israel Twitter account starts saying mean tweets are terrorism? You know that's gonna happen.
Oh my God, that
Twitter account is.
Does every country have a Twitter account? Please don't say we do.
Oh, I'm sure we do.
We did.
Yeah,
that is insane. Who even gets that job? Like, and
imagine
the responsibility.
Intern.
Yeah.
How is like that account could start a war? We talked about Trump tweeting and causing a war, but at least he was like elected. Like who is that person?
Well, we have
not elected.
But our soldiers are not old people, right? I mean, we have basically children fighting wars for us.
Yeah, they're like 18,
so does the IDF.
Years old. Yeah, and it's like mandatory conscription. Like everyone has to serve in the Israeli Defense Forces. That's part of their like brainwashing and propaganda machine is everyone has to serve in the military.
Or you go to jail. I did see someone
Yeah, or you
say
go to
that, like,
jail.
that they just got out of jail because they refused to enter the IDF.
I heard it's fun. I heard people enjoy it, which is really
What, the
sweet.
IDF?
That's what they want you to think.
Yeah.
That's, yeah.
Well, 'cause,
Another
like, everyone
thing
complains
that-
about Korean conscription. Nobody wants to go into the Korean army, but
Also another thing that the state of Israel does is that like if you have y'all heard of birthright?
yeah.
Yeah. So like if you're Jewish, live in the States or something, you can take a free trip to Israel and then like the state of Israel like shows you around. And that's
Adam's
part of,
brother
like-
went.
Yeah, my brother went on Birthright.
Also, if you are Jewish living anywhere in the world, you can move into a settlement in the West Bank. It doesn't matter if you've never been to Palestine, never
Yep.
been to Israel. If you are Jewish, you can settle in the West Bank.
But they don't want you if you're too old.
Really?
You can't be above a certain age
You have to
and
be fertile?
and go on Birthright.
Wait, birthright or this like settlement
birth-
thing?
Birthright.
Oh yeah, that's got an age thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Italy has their own version of Birthright too. I just
Oh, yeah?
learned today. But anyway, all
Time
right.
to wrap it up.
Yeah, and it's called repatriation. But I guess it's like an official program. But yeah. So thank you, Amanda, so much for being on this stream.
Yeah, thanks
I
so
think
much.
we're gonna try to make them less than 2 hours, but we're
Well,
we're
we
at hour
succeeded
40.
This time. We succeeded. Plenty of
Yes,
time
but-
Technically.
to spare. Yeah.
Technically, we did succeed. But thanks so much for being on. Hopefully,
Thanks for having me on.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Your knowledge,
we wanted to
and your
tackle
history
this-
lesson, it was great.
We wanted
Did you
to
already-
tackle this topic, so it was cool to see that you had some time to share because you've been super busy lately.
Yeah.
So we appreciate it.
No, thank you for the invitation.
All right, well, thanks
it's
for-
it's a little. I have to admit, as someone who regularly deals with Zionists and China watchers,
Yeah.
China watchers I can like pretty much ignore, but Zionists get under my skin in a way that China watchers don't, and I can't help but engage. So it's like this issue is like something I'm like kind of sensitive about. But
Yeah.
thank you for inviting me on and allowing me to talk about it.
Absolutely.
Is there anybody you want to? Did you already have a chance to do this? I know I missed the first half.
That's okay.
Is there anybody you want to plug? Shout outs?
Me?
Yeah.
Not really. You can follow me on Cat Content Only. If you want to support the Palestinian resistance, look up BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions. And like it's basically Palestinian organizers. It's a way that Palestinian organizers are asking people outside of Palestine to support their cause. So.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Also,
Cool.
if people didn't listen to the episode that she was on with Jess and Gina, it's
Ah,
257, titled Sanity Check 2021. Really great episode. So everyone, if you haven't listened to that, listen to that.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Have a good
Have a
night.
good night, everyone. Join us next week, same time.
Same time.
So.